thank you, Mark, for the very warm second introduction, and my apologies for a bit of a scrambled schedule, but I'm delighted to be here. My talk is not purely about food coloring or food dyes in particular, so it's in that context that I begin the presentation. It's broader than that, but food dyes are a particular component of this as well. I'm not speaking formally on behalf of the American Academy of Pediatrics, though I will be presenting the findings of our technical report and policy statement on food additives, which was just published last year. By way of introduction, the American Academy of Pediatrics is not your liberal environmental NGO. It's 67,000 pediatricians and child health leaders from across the entire political spectrum. The Council on Environmental Health is the home of experts who focus in particular on environmental contaminants and their impact on children's health. As such, the Academy advises its board of directors on a host of issues and publishes policy statements and technical reports through a very rigorous internal and external review process. Having gone through it, and I'm actually going through another as we speak, I can say that this is running the gauntlet at some level. And we're also privileged to publish the Pediatric Environmental Health Green Book, as we call it, the complement to the Red Book, which is famous for infectious diseases, which is now in its third edition. So these are the statements that we published in 2018. The technical report is focused heavily on the science regarding the effects of the best known chemicals used in food additives, either intentionally or unintentionally incorporated into food, whereas the policy statement reviews the current regulatory context in the United States, at least, and policy changes that we recommend are important to protect children's health. And we looked in particular at epidemiologic as well as toxicological data. And as I mentioned at the outset, this report is not purely about food colorings. It's about chemicals that, again, absorb into food unintentionally, if you will, as a byproduct of contact with food packaging and such, as well as chemicals deliberately added to food. We did exclude a number of chemical contaminants known to be included in food, and these include the PCBs, dioxins, metals, aflatoxin, and such, and they, in part, were represented in other scientific reports in the Academy, so just to parse out what the focus of this report really is. Now, the context of this broader report, which I don't think has actually, just having listened to a day and a half of discussion, is really, the context of our report was really heavily emphasizing the emerging scientific evidence of synthetic chemicals and their impact on the endocrine system in particular. And that's the context in which the emerging science really adds to concern with respect to the impacts of these chemicals on children's health. So this is a basic definition of endocrine disruptors. There are a variety of definitions out there. I would say the commonality amongst the three major definitions, WHO, EU, and US EPA, is that you have to disrupt a endocrine function in a variety of ways. Now, that can be through epigenetic or modifications not in the genomic lettering, but in the expression of genes, all the way to direct binding of a receptor for a hormone in particular. And the reason I'm emphasizing that, and then the second component is a direct physiological effect on the human, the reason I'm making that, that emphasis on and point is that most of the regulatory context and focus on endocrine disruption is on one, perhaps two or three hormonal systems, thyroid, estrogen, and androgen, whereas the reality is there are thousands of endocrine signaling molecules across a host of physiologic functions. So we have historically shown the light in a place where that's perhaps a corner of a room rather than the entire room. Now, endocrine disruption isn't a new and emerging concept. The first scientific statement that really put this issue on the map was in 2009 by the Endocrine Society. For full disclosure, I also am a member of the Endocrine Society and am involved in a clinical task force on endocrine disrupting chemicals. Then in 2012, the World Health Organization, United Nations Environment Program documented endocrine disruption as an emerging global public health threat. And this brought a lot of sturm and drang from the chemical industry, largely. There was a back and forth substantially in the scientific literature and in the UN's body for dealing with endocrine disrupting chemicals, the Strategic Alliance for International Chemicals Management. It's not just endocrine disrupting chemicals they focus on. They focus on the global chemical context. They formally welcomed the 2012 report documenting minimal and specific sector disagreement on a scientific level with the statement. And in 2015, as you see on the right, the Endocrine Society documented yet another scientific statement. It's a little unusual for a scientific society to come out with 2 reports in 6 years. And that's because of the emerging human evidence that compelled them with 1,331 scientific references to boot, documenting the greater and in particular more proximate human health concern that these chemicals pose to children in particular, but to all of us. Now, pivoting back to the American Academy of Pediatrics report, we focused most prominently on the 4 categories of chemicals listed here with respect to indirect food additives, so chemicals that absorb into food and are not intentionally added to foods. The bisphenols, which are used in aluminum can linings, also in thermal paper receipts, and the concerns you see on the right-hand column, I'll let you read those. Phthalates, which are used in soft, typically vinyl plastic, but also can contaminate through personal care products and cosmetics. The perfluoroalkyl chemicals, which are used in nonstick cooking, as well as emerging, including some compostable food packages for buffet style meals, which should make you a bit uncomfortable as you go into lunch. And then the perchlorate, which is an antistatic agent, which is a well-known thyroid toxicant. Now, with respect to the direct food additives, the report did mention and raise concern about artificial food coloring, in particular because of the neurobehavioral effects. It cautioned that the scientific evidence was limited. And some of the most prominent limitations are simply the substantial scope of unknowns that exist about the degree of exposure. I mean, we've seen some wonderful state-of-the-art presentations, but they're not even published yet, which speaks to how little we actually know about the degree of exposure, the vulnerability of age-specific populations, which have unique and particular developmental concerns for the consequences, especially of higher exposures per pound of body weight. And as the previous presenter outlined, there is particular focus on attention deficit hyperactivity as a particular concern. So in the remainder of the presentation, I wanted to provide some policy context and suggestions for the report, and in particular about some broader concern about the mixtures and milieu of chemical contaminants in foods, not just the food coloring universe, which arguably is a bit of a regulatory island in the broader milieu of food additive chemicals. But the reality is there are as many unknowns, and we do not exist in a single chemical universe, let alone a chemical universe that's isolated to food dyes in particular, even if they're studied in a careful mixture. So the federal framework has been reviewed by a number of others already, so I won't give this too much focus. In particular, my emphasis here is on the generally recognized safe exemption, which has historically been used going back to the 1950s. though the regulatory context for food chemicals, as many of you know, it goes back to 1938. In particular, there was an update in 1997, but it was really modestly focused on an approval process for food contact substances. Let me just add some emphasis here on the definition of food additive. I've already reviewed this to some extent. There are chemicals that are intentionally added to foods, and then there are these indirect food additives. So when the Academy was thinking about this report, and I was privileged to be one of the lead authors, in particular, we were looking at the broader food processing system and the implications for chemical contamination all the way proverbially from farm to table via industry as well as directly. So the broader question here is whether the safety system is appropriate. Now there's a review that is quite relevant in this respect. When you look at, again, the broader milieu of food additives, the FD&C chemicals are particularly a unique regulatory context in which there is a stronger requirement for data. But when you look by the study of Neltner and colleagues that looked at nearly 4,000 direct additives, you see severe and serious gaps, with nearly 2/3 having no oral toxicology data, assuming that oral is the main route by which the toxicology or the ADME pathways can be activated. And then in particular, when you go to reproductive toxicology data, you're at 93% with no such data. So huge islands of gaps. Now, this report emphasized in particular the GRAS designation and limitations to FDA authority and procedures. And let me just take a moment to emphasize the definition of GRAS. Essentially, this is a blanket exemption that allows an industry scientist to, or a scientist, to attest safety without very much in the way of a regulatory data train to support this designation, and essentially handcuffs the FDA in particular with respect to the ability to proceed and insist on more data, let alone intervene when there are concerns identified. And there's an extensive conflict of interest issue that has been described by a number of authors. This is essentially the fox guarding the proverbial henhouse in many ways. I'm going to just take a moment here and just emphasize that the FDA has really, perhaps with the exception of food dyes, no authority to obtain data or reassess safety. A serious gap, and I would say this runs the entire gamut of food chemicals, including dyes, is really there's no oversight over mixtures, synergy, additivity, et cetera, which is a serious concern. I also will draw a big, bold line here around the outdated toxicological mindset. I've already alluded to it. When you're looking at single or 2 to 3 hormonal systems, let alone looking at crude neurotoxicological testing, which arguably has not really had a modern paradigm going back 50 years or more, you have some serious limitations to your ability to interpret the available data. And in particular with neurobehavioral and or endocrine endpoints, there are serious implications. And Dr. Bradman and other presenters have already emphasized the need for filling in data gaps that consider the unique additional exposure burden per unit body weight due to dietary intake being greater in children compared to us adults per pound body weight. So what do people do? And I'm not going to take a long time on this because this is not the context for the presentation. Just had the privilege of actually, out of the blue today, I don't know why it came out today, New York Times had an article talking about our recommendations as an academy on avoiding chemical exposures through plastics. But the Academy report in particular emphasizes the need to avoid processed foods, avoid microwaving plastic containers in particular, or food in those plastic containers, and avoiding using them in the dishwasher, and in particular avoiding plastics with the recycling numbers 3, 6, and 7. I would say even now, a year later, if I had the privilege of rewriting this report, I would actually also draw a broader line around the notion that perhaps we need to think about reducing plastic use, period, for broader ecological as well as human health concerns. The Academy was particularly sensitive to low-income and low-resource populations, in particular with respect to its recommendations. But the recommendations I'm talking about here are steeped in dietary interventions that have proven reductions in exposure to chemicals of concern. So this is a small but informative study from Ruth Ann Rudell and colleagues at Sound Spring, where they did a dietary substitution experiment and literally reduced levels of bisphenols and phthalates between 53 and 56% for bisphenol A and DEHP. So the Academy recommendations emphasize a need to revise the GRASP process, a need to coordinate to fill data gaps, ideally even in a global way would be fine from the Academy's perspective. It's about getting the data, period. Establishing a mechanism to retest approved chemicals, because many were approved in an older antiquated understanding of toxicology, in particular with respect to the endocrine system. The emphasis was also placed on the need to consider safety factors for children and synergistic and cumulative effects. And that can be done largely without congressional or executive branch oversight, though the FDA is going to sit within HHS and the executive milieu, so there is some oversight and limitation. It will require political will within the executive branch. But it doesn't require legislation, though the Academy did emphasize a need for congressional perhaps intervention on behalf of children's health to provide a stronger regulatory context. Again, with concern about minimizing conflict of interest being one prominent component. So Mark alluded to some of the cost work I've done. I'm going to take a few minutes, if I still have got time, to just focus particularly on a couple of food additive chemicals. And in this regard, I just want to emphasize the serious and substantial economic burden to society that chemical toxicity poses at a societal level through effects on children, and the potential net economic benefits of safer substitutes. Often the argument against changing out is that there's a cost, additional, that's ultimately passed to the consumer, that's borne by the manufacturer. There are limits to the extent to which that is a real substantive issue. So I'm going to focus first as a case in point on bisphenol A, which was banned in baby bottles and sippy cups, but not banned in cans or other uses. We did a simulation experiment first, before the simulation, looking at the disease burden for 2 outcomes that can be traced to bisphenol A in the form of childhood obesity and adult cardiovascular disease. But the simulation was, what if the FDA actually got BPA out of cans? What would be the difference in exposure? And what would be the economic benefit associated? What might be the cost of changing out BPA? So here's the cost profile for those 2 outcomes, and it's just 2 of the litany of chemical effects associated with BPA that have been documented. $3 billion in 2008. One alternative, oleoresin. I'm not suggesting that oleoresin is potentially usable in all of the existing BPA uses today, but the cost, 100 billion cans, 2.2 cents on the can, we're talking about $2.2 billion. The net economic benefit in the counterfactual, that simulation experiment I talked about where we reduced exposure based upon known intervention studies, produces a net reduction in disease such that the costs saved in disease are 1.7 billion. So you're almost at a wash, and that's just 2 of the disease endpoints associated with bisphenol A. And their sensitivity analyses, these are uncertainties that we had to consider in our analysis in the economic modeling in particular that suggest a benefit to cost ratio. It's actually potentially as high as 6 to 1. So there actually could be net economic benefits to getting BPA out. Now, the reality is here, again, due to the regulatory flaws in the process, we have largely in society been taking an approach that's more like chemical whack-a-mole, where media attention raises concern about one chemical like BPA, and now there are 40 artists formerly known as BPA, as I like to call them, including bisphenol S. Bisphenol S is chemically, as you see, similar to BPA, and structure does follow function with limitations, but BPS is as estrogenic, as persistent in the environment, and as toxic to embryos. So literally, we've replaced BPA with BPS and swapped one problem out for another. Now, Mark alluded to at the end of the presentation, the broader societal impact. This is what I'm about to describe as more of a cost profile of endocrine disrupting chemicals. There are limits in what we know, and there are limits in to what extent we can draw, for lack of a better way of describing it, causal inference. But what little we know, accounting for the uncertainty and causality, suggests that endocrine disrupting chemicals cost Europe on the order of 160 billion euro each year, 1.2% of its gross domestic product. And that's an annual cost insofar as exposures continue at current levels. And yet, that's based on less than 5% of known endocrine disrupting chemicals, a subset of diseases due to those chemicals, and a subset of costs due to those subset of diseases due to the subset of chemicals. So this 163 is likely an underestimate of an underestimate of an underestimate. And you can see it's driven largely by what we know, and in particular neurobehavioral effects, which is important for this group to keep in mind, in this case of organophosphate pesticides, because those are the chemicals that are best documented with their effects. Now take that from Europe to the US, and I want to make an important distinction here. Policy predicts exposure, exposure contributes to disease, and disease costs us all as a society. In the US, those costs are $340 billion, 2.3% of our gross domestic product. The pesticide costs go down because we have a good regulation with respect at the interface of EPA, USDA, and food, with agriculture in the Food Quality Protection Act, which added an additional safety factor for children and thereby led to reductions in residues of organophosphate pesticides compared to our European partners, despite the fact that I would argue that organic market share is higher there than here. With flame retardants, we have the opposite story. It's a little bit ironic to say here in California because California actually is the faulty party. In this respect, TB 117 required flame retardants be added from the 70s to about 2013. Fortunately, we stopped that, and now there's a great label. So bravo, California, in particular for actually requiring disclosure of flame retardant use. And actually, there's been a lot of attention, thank you, in reducing flame retardant use in carpeting, furniture as a result. But in the United States, we still carry a legacy where we have much higher levels of flame retardants in our serum compared to any country in the world. Maybe Canada, Mexico are second and third place, but that's because of NAFTA that essentially allowed a trade of those materials across the border. But suffice it to say, the cost is $240 billion for flame retardants. In Europe, where they more proactively ban them, $9 billion. So you have this converse story where if you do the right thing in a policy perspective, as we did for pesticides, you not only reduce disease, you save the economy. And a big driver of this is lost economic productivity. And that's because if a child loses an IQ point, or a child may have even a 0.1 change in their ADHD score, not even a 0.2 change in their ADHD score, the pediatrician might not notice, the teacher might not notice, the parent, no offense, might not notice. But if 100,000 children have that kind of shift, the entire economy notices. And that's ultimately the message that I leave with you here. I'm not certainly suggesting that we have a cost burden associated with food dyes that can be quantified with precision. Not at all. But it does speak to the substantial human health and economic impact of the suite of chemicals, which to a large extent is substantially understudied. And with that, I have a lot of people to thank. As I mentioned, the Academy has a rigorous process in addition to its own internal committee review process of this report. I especially would like to thank Sheila Satanarayana and Rachel Schaefer, both of the University of Washington, who are the lead co-authors of the report and contributed substantially to moving this forward. Thank you very much. I look forward to your questions.